We need to talk about the student protests that are sweeping across America's college campuses. Students are calling for their universities to divest from Israel, divest from the military industrial complex in general, and to bring an end to Israel's assault on Gaza. But because everything is dumb, I've been told the only way we're allowed to view these protests and this conflict in general is through a culture war lens. Woke versus anti woke. The woke are brainwashed, anti Semitic, terrorist sympathizers who want to destroy the West, while the anti woke are patriotic Americans with high moral Western values. And because Israel also is a democracy with these Western values, we must support them, or Western civilization is in peril. And I simply reject this premise. I'm Stephanie Edmonds. Welcome to Teaching Liberty. To live free, you have to think free. And that is a particularly hard thing to do in such a contentious time in this country. We all have our own experiences and biases, and it's human nature to retreat to those places where there are people who are reinforcing our biases and further entrenching us into our own team. And unfortunately, that is exactly what I see happening with these protests. They're dividing the American people and distracting us from the true culprits, our elected leaders and their war profiteering cronies. I want to talk about what's actually happening at these protests and what is not happening, and why I believe this is all designed to distract regular Americans and by extension the world. But I think it would be useful to preface that conversation by recalling the history of one of our founding fathers and second president of the United States, John Adams. Adams went from being a principled young lawyer who was willing to take the unpopular but just position of defending British soldiers who were accused of killing 5 colonists. However, by the time he was in the White House, he was a politician who was willing to use the power of the government to punish his political enemies under the guise of a foreign war. So hit that like button, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have that notification bell on. Leave a comment down below to let me know your thoughts, and let's get into this. So John Adams, before becoming president and before becoming a representative in the Continental Congress, he was a lawyer living and working in Boston with his wife and a growing family. Following the French and Indian War, the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies grew increasingly contentious. There were a series of taxations levied upon them, and the troops were permanently stationed in the colonies. And on March 5th, 1770, the inevitable happened. A group of British soldiers fired their weapons at a crowd of colonists, killing 5 and injuring others. And the colonists of Boston, especially Sam Adams, who was John's cousin and leader of the patriot group, the Sons of Liberty, were in no mood for an impartial judgment of the facts. So what did John Adams do? He took up the case and he defended the soldiers because it was the right thing to do. Now, we only have Adams' words for what he said to James Forrest, the British loyalist who came to his house the night of the incident to ask for Adams' help. But this is what he claims to have said. I had no hesitation in answering that counsel ought to be the very last thing an accused person should want in a free country. To the modern ear, that turn of phrase is a little bit awkward, but what he means there is that this is a free country. Of course, any person should have a lawyer. It shouldn't be something that you want for. It should just be automatic. That the bar ought, in my opinion, to be independent and impartial at all times and in every circumstance, and that persons whose lives were at stake ought to have the counsel they preferred. But he must be sensible. This would be as important a cause as ever was tried in any court or country of the world, and that every lawyer must hold himself responsible not only to his country, but to the highest and most infallible of all tribunals for the part he should act. He must therefore expect from me no art, nor dress, no sophistry or prevarication in such a cause, nor anything more than fact, evidence, and law would justify. And as it turns out, the events of that night, of what became known as the Boston Massacre, were not clear-cut. There was a lot going on. A mob of about 60 angry townspeople had descended upon the guards at the custom house. And when reinforcements were called in, the crowd became more and more unruly. They started hurling not just taunts, but ice and snow, rocks, oyster shells, broken glass. And in the heat of the confusing scene, the British fired on the crowd and took the lives of 5 men and injured others. Although the soldiers claimed to have acted in self-defense, Patriot propaganda referred to the incident as the Boston Massacre. 8 British soldiers and their officer in charge, Captain Thomas Preston, faced charges for murdering 5 colonists. However, thanks to John Adams' unyielding pursuit for the truth, Captain Preston and 4 of his men were cleared of all charges. 2 others were convicted of manslaughter, but were sentenced to a branding of the thumb rather than hanging, which would have been the sentence if they were found guilty of murder. According to Dan Abrams, author of John Adams Under Fire, the Founding Fathers' Fight for Justice in the Boston Massacre Murder Trial, this was a case of firsts. This was the first time reasonable doubt had ever been used as a standard, and it was the first time a jury was sequestered. Abrams said, quote, "I think part of the reason certain aspects of this case became enshrined was because this case was viewed in such a positive light historically. At the time, colonists were frustrated at the result, but I think they realized the trial had been fair. And if you can have a case with this much emotion and passion and get a mixed verdict, which was generally unsatisfying to the colonists, and yet have it accepted, that is the kind of case that serves as effective precedent." I recount this episode of American history because it not just lays the groundwork for some very important legal precedents, but because it establishes one of the most foundational elements of American society. The truth is more important than what is popular. And even though the outcome wasn't popular, because Adams had conducted himself professionally and honestly, the Bostonians accepted that unpopular decision. And not only that, but Adams was revered as a lawyer, and ultimately, it positioned him to become a representative in the Continental Congress, and then go on to be the vice president and president of the United States. However, that's not where Adams' story ends. Unfortunately, as he moved on in his political career, his objectivity and impartiality faded away, and he became more embroiled in the party politics of the day. The election of 1796 was the first American election that saw 2 organized political parties wrestle for power at the ballot box. John Adams emerged as president, with Thomas Jefferson as the runner-up. I covered the complete history of this election in my video, The History of Party Politics, so go check that one out after this video for the full history. But for the purposes here today, just know that during Washington's tenure as president, the once united founding fathers splintered into political factions. Adams was associated with the Federalists, which also had a more extreme faction known as the Ultra or High Federalists, and on the other side were the Republicans, led by Jefferson, dealing with issues domestically and abroad, as well as political jockeying within the White House and Congress. Adams' once principled stance on the truth faded away. The radical factions of the Federalist Party pressed to pass the Alien and Seditions Act. The Alien Act allowed for the federal government to deport any immigrant who was deemed a threat to peace or the government. The Sedition Acts stipulated that any individual criticizing the government, including the president, could be arrested. Adams signed the legislation and later poorly defended his reservations, saying it was a wartime measure. Sounds familiar, huh? The Republicans, led by Jefferson, argued this was not about protecting the country, this was about protecting the Adams administration. He argued that it was a violation of not just the First Amendment by stifling legitimate criticism of the government and shutting down freedom of speech, but it also violated the 9th and 10th Amendments. The fierce Republican opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts likely contributed to Jefferson's victory in the presidential election of 1800. And once in office, Jefferson pardoned those convicted under the Sedition Act, which had expired on the last day of Adams' term. However, as president, Jefferson himself went after rival Federalist editors. This controversy reveals that even the founders themselves would violate the First Amendment and other laws of the land for political purposes. The Jeffersonian Republicans believed the Federalists were monarchists and they had to be stopped at all costs, whereas the Federalists believed the Republicans were anarchists and had to be stopped at all costs. Today, instead of Federalists and Republicans, we have the woke and the anti-woke. Entrenched ideologies eager to weaponize the power of the government against one another, using the justification that it must be done to save the country. However, taking a historical perspective on the issue, it's easy to see that reaching for the truth from an objective point of view, rather than a politically charged one, leads to better decisions, and ones that people can trust, even if it's not popular or the one that they agree with. When you are constantly arguing that the ends justify the means, for example, when you declare that Trump is such a threat to democracy that we have to upend democracy to prevent him from winning, no one can trust anything you do after that, and it opens up the door to political retribution. And likewise, when you declare you are a free speech absolutist, that you detest government censorship, and you make fun of blue-haired college kids for whining about microaggressions and demanding safe spaces, but then you turn around and claim protesters who say things you deem as hateful need to be dispersed and arrested by the government, you're handing more power to the government you were just complaining was weaponizing that power against you. And unfortunately, that is exactly what is happening with these student protests. The coalition who I consider myself a part of, the anti-woke, free speech warriors standing up for fundamental American principles, have suddenly turned into safe space wokies, seemingly without an ounce of self-reflection. And they're now proclaiming hateful speech must be stifled, and protesters must be squashed with the force of police or even the National Guard. The anti-woke were the ones who were at the receiving ends of accusations of hate speech, of being racist bigots during the COVID era. They would often hearken back to the time when the ACLU stood up to protect the speech of neo-Nazis and complained that the modern ACLU had lost its path. Now, it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyways, just to clear up any confusion. If there are people who are not protesting peacefully, and they are instead engaging in things that we all agree are illegal, like actual harassment and violence, this shouldn't be tolerated, and the culprits should be arrested and charged accordingly. But that's not what is happening. And like a young Adams or Jefferson, I don't form my opinion on political issues based on who I like and who I don't like, who's on my team and who's not on my team. Sure, the company you keep can often correlate with what is right and what is wrong much of the time, but not always. It's certainly not a metric that can be used alone. There must be other considerations, and the one that I think is most important is a consistent principle of individual liberty. That's why when the pandemic hit, instead of just going along with what most teachers thought, that it wasn't safe to open schools, I chose to speak out for the schools to open. Because even though it was unpopular, it cost me my teacher friend group, got me called all sorts of names, had attempts to get me fired or in trouble at work by contacting my employer, which were ultimately successful and got me reprimanded at school and told to shut down my social media, even though I was the one at which the rude ad hominem attacks are being hurled. And even though my ideas have all been proven correct, schools should have opened, I was the one who got in trouble because I expressed wrongthink. I expressed ideas that were politically unpopular, but I don't regret it, and I never will, because it was the right thing to do. And looking back, I think most people agree. So when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue, it's no different. I believe what Israel is doing and has been doing for decades now is wrong. And I won't be scared off by accusations of sympathizing with terrorists or being shamed for coming to the same conclusion as woke college kids. Ultimately, my goal is to try to bring people together from various perspectives and on the basis of shared principles and values, right? We don't have to agree on how they're applied at all times, but we should at least attempt to be objective and to have a productive discourse focused on ideas rather than on political allegiances and who we perceive to be on our team versus on the other team. These are peaceful protests. They may be advocating for a position you disagree with, and you're free to set up a counter protest or use your free speech to advocate for your position. A lot of people are trying to compare this to the summer of 2020. And yes, it's a lot of the same groups and same people perhaps organizing it, but these protests are not the protests that were happening in 2020. These are peaceful, whereas what happened in 2020 was clearly not peaceful. It wasn't even mostly peaceful. Seeing the government come out in full force against these peaceful college protesters, we know that in 2020, they could have prevented those protests from getting out of control, and they chose not to. And so the authorities choosing to use such force for peaceful protests is also a choice. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. This is about we the people, whether we're woke lefties or we're anti-woke Republicans or MAGA Republicans or America First or whatever it is. It's all of us, we the people, versus whoever it is up there pulling those strings to get us agitated. And in doing so, we don't actually have the real conversation that our government just stole $100 billion of our grandchildren's money that we don't have, to redistribute it to foreign nations and fuel forever war. And the more people cheer on the suppression of these protests and call for the police to arrest people, the easier it will be when you want to stand up for something for the government to come and use those same tactics against you. So while I might not be taking the popular position, while many people who I have been associated with and friendly with and gone to protests with and done advocacy with over the past 4 years might not understand how I could land where I did on this, I do believe by sticking to the principles of individual liberty and consistently applying them across all situations, regardless if I end up marching next to MAGA Republicans or progressive open school moms or, revolutionary socialists, I will always stand for the truth. And with that, I'll leave you with a quote said by a thinker who I admire and posted by a thinker who I admire, both of whom are known for taking unpopular positions exactly when we need them to. Every great idea starts as a minority one. If you're not comfortable being the only person who believes something, you're ruling out the possibility that you will make a great discovery. Brett Weinstein, posted by Alexandros Marinos. Whether a great discovery or the rediscovery of a great idea, stand up for what you believe in, even if you have to stand alone. Thank you for joining me. If you like this content, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And let me know what you think in those comments down below. Oh yeah, share this with your friends. We have to spread unpopular ideas. And until next time, think free, live free, and give all the glory to God.